This video will explore the themes of memory and remembrance in Sebastian Faulks' Birdsong. The two themes are connected in some ways, but they are also separate entities, and we'll look at both, but particularly the way in which memory informs notions of remembrance. I want to start here with Stephen Raceford's line that he writes in his journal that his granddaughter Elizabeth reads later in the novel. No future generation will ever know what this was like. So Stephen himself, as Faulks' protagonist, confirms that actually true remembrance is not possible, and we're going to look at modern society's attempts to remember and the reasons why they can't truly remember. We'll start with Elizabeth and the sections of the novel that take place in England in 1978 and 1979, and it seems to me that Elizabeth's function in the novel and these sections of the novel, their function is to confirm the idea of inappropriate remembrance, and in many ways these sections act as a criticism of modern society and therefore the modern reader of our attempts to remember the war dead of World War I. It's important to remember that this section of the novel takes place only 60 years after the end of World War I, which is difficult to believe in many ways because the worlds are completely incomparable. There is an utter contrast of experience between those two worlds, but they are only 60 years apart. And I think that helps to confirm quite how alien the world of World War I is to a modern audience, modern reader. Elizabeth is the most sympathetic character from that section of the novel. Although we are encouraged to be critical of her in parts, we must also sympathise with her because she's the only character really in that section of the novel who makes any attempt to reconnect with the past, and she remains completely isolated in her quest to remember. So we're going to start with the inappropriate nature of remembrance and the way in which Faulks criticises modern society's attempts to remember. And the best place to go for that is the section of the novel on page 262 to 264, where Elizabeth visits the Thiepval Memorial. And the way in which this memorial is described, and you can see it in the picture on the slide here, confirms how inappropriate it is perhaps as a memorial to the dead. It doesn't really capture in Faulks's mind or in Elizabeth's what it should. It's described as having a brutal modern design and in fact reminds Elizabeth of the buildings of the Third Reich. It could not be more inappropriate. It says that the faces of the memorial are obliterated on all sides by the names that were carved on them, and that word obliterated suggests to us that in Faulks's opinion the memorial is not appropriate. It's garish in some way even. And then at the end of this, Elizabeth has no idea of the scale of suffering that she is trying to uncover. She believes that it's all the war dead on this memorial, and in fact it's confirmed to her that actually all those names, which are extensive and vast, all of those names are just the missing from those fields only. We also see how difficult it is for Elizabeth to remember when she uncovers Stephen's belongings, the notebook and other things in the attic of her mother's house. The dust from it dried the skin on her fingers and set her teeth on edge. It clearly makes her extremely uncomfortable at first, this connection with the past, and the parcel fell apart limply, dropping its guts into her hand. Well, we see in dropping its guts a clear connection with the past, but the fact that it fell apart limply shows us how loose that connection really is. And this impossibility and futility of remembrance becomes vividly clear, even more vividly clear, through Gray's lines on page 427. Here he talks about the way in which future society will remember. Think of the words on that memorial, Raceford. Think of those stinking towns and foul bloody villages whose names will be turned into some bogus glory by fat-arsed historians who have sat in London. There's already a bitterness in the soldiers because they know that future generations will never be able to appreciate what they've been through. And it seems that Gray and the other soldiers are already bitter about the futile attempts of modern society to remember. He even uses the word chisel, which is used in the same section in Elizabeth's part of the novel, where she looks at the chiselled capitals. So there is a clear sense that Gray already knows that modern society is going to miss the mark. And there is no question that Faulks is critical of modern society's attempts to remember, even through the character of Elizabeth, who is the only one who tries. Again, she had touched the past, it had stopped being history and had turned into experience. And then she is obsessed with the idea of completing the circle, and she believes she has completed the circle in connecting herself to the past. And it's the naivety of those beliefs which I think confirm Faulks's criticism of us. There's no way she's turned history into experience, and she has not in any way completed the circle. And Faulks also confirms the naivety of that belief in connection through some of the metaphors and symbols that he uses in Elizabeth's section of the novel. They appear to be quite clunky connections with the past. The train of the Central line fitted its tube like a bullet in the barrel of a rifle. But I think the clunkiness of those connections is deliberate. He's confirming to us that the connection with the past is not as straightforward as we would like it to be. But he does give plenty of reasons why this connection with the past is so difficult. It's not entirely our fault. And the first notion is in terms of distance. This world seems very distant, even though for Elizabeth it's only 60 years previous. The topics seem too large, too fraught, and too remote, and the repetition there confirms how far away she is from understanding. But the characters around her are even more callous and cruel, actually, in their depiction of the war. What are you so suddenly interested in ancient history for, is Irene's reflection. Ancient history is a particularly callous term, given that it's only 60 years previous. Elizabeth looks through some photos and falls upon one of what she describes as a moon-faced boy. Well, the moon-faced is a really interesting line to confirm how distant she is from that world. This world is almost ethereal, and it is certainly untouchable. But it's not just modern society that experience this distance, and that is what really allows us to feel a lack of guilt, really, for our inability to remember. Because when Weir goes home, the way his father reacts confirms how distant he is from his son. He reached out a hand and touched his left bicep. There's even a physical distance between Weir and his father at this point. The other reason, one of the other reasons that Faulks allows us to understand the futility of remembrance is through the isolation of time. It is clear in so many sections of the novel that the soldiers are frozen in this moment of time. They are frozen in the world of war. And so that means that we are therefore unable to connect to them. So any attempt is ultimately futile. We see it when Weir goes home. He was waiting for a moment when the familiar wash of normality would come over him and he would be restored to his old self. But he never is, and he hears lots of sounds that remind him of warfare. He can never really escape. When Elizabeth goes to visit Brennan, he is described as a man who lives in a world of his own. His last visitor was in 1949. And then twice he's referred to as a bird on a perch. Brennan seems to be a man who is stuck in some form of purgatory between these two worlds. He belongs to the world he's now living in, but only in physical form, because he's actually stuck in the world 60 years earlier. So he seems to be a man who's teetering between two worlds, and so any connection to him is ultimately impossible. And there are lots of references to the word static in the novel when describing the memories and images of warfare. This one relates to Stephen. The burned images of the preceding days lived in his mind with static clarity. They do not move into the future, these images. They remain where they were, and they remain with the soldiers. And so the word static helps to confirm this impossibility of connection. A further reason why true remembrance is impossible is because of the unique nature of the collective experiences of the soldiers, and this is a common theme throughout the literature of World War I. Such was the alien world in which they were operating that they had to establish connections which were new and unique and alien from the world that they knew before and the world that they went on to live in afterwards. We see it in Firebrace's connection with Arthur Shaw. He slept as well with Shaw as he had ever slept with Margaret in London. Shaw had been in this strange alternate life the only person in the world to him, his handsome face with its level eyes, his muscular back. There's a masculine connection that reminds us almost of lovers or of partners. So the shaping of the world, of what we understand about male and female relationships, has been changed and cannot go back. Stephen reflects after Weir's death, only Weir had been with him to the edges of the reality where he now lived. This is a new reality and a detached reality from the one that he knew before or the one that he will know afterwards. And Stephen says to Gray, I know I was there, I saw the great void in your soul and you saw mine. Well, no other human being can see that outside of the world of war. And then we get this idea repeated again and again in the novel that the world has been forever changed by the events of World War I and can never return. And therefore the people in the world afterwards can never hope to understand, because the world has been tilted, put out of kilter. The understanding of the way the world works has changed forever. Stephen says what he longed for was an end to the day and to the new unlivable reality it had brought, and that's after the Battle of the Somme, the big battle in the novel. The pattern of the seasons of night and day was gone. The understanding of the way the world works has changed, and so how can we possibly hope to understand it? And Isabel reflects on this when Stephen goes to visit her on his return to Amiens. He seemed a man removed to some new existence where he was dug in and fortified by his lack of natural feeling and repose. She feared to reach out more than a hand to whatever world he now inhabited. First of all, Stephen seems a man stuck in, removed to some new existence. But look at the words in the semantic field of warfare here, dug in and fortified. He is a man stuck in that world and cannot escape it. And Isabel is unable to connect to that world. But we also see another reason, and this is where Faulks is critical of us, because part of our inability to connect is our fear of what we'll find. Isabel here, she feared to reach out more than a hand to whatever world he now inhabited. So there is a fear, and that's our responsibility. One other reason, though, is this notion of propaganda and secrecy. The idea that the soldiers could not or would not express the experiences of World War I, either because they didn't want to confront them or because they didn't have the means to express them. Let's not forget that these experiences are ones which have never been experienced before or would never be afterwards. So in many ways, the soldiers don't have the vocabulary to express. They don't have the language to express quite how horrific their experiences were. and therefore they cannot convey them to the people back home or the world post-World War One. It's interesting that Faulks uses hardly any metaphor or simile in the war sections of the novel. He does use some, but it's sparse. It's almost as if if you're going to use a metaphor or a simile, you need to be able to compare it to something else. And it seems that in Faulks's mind, those events can't be compared to anything else. There's no context to compare them to. And because of that, the soldiers are depicted in this novel, and this is a very real experience, as being silent after the war. Stephen's notebook is written in Greek script. It's impenetrable almost. It does get translated eventually, but there are still gaps in the understanding. But it's designed to be impenetrable. He didn't speak for 2 years after the war. But there's also the idea that the people back home and since are fed a diet of, or not lies, but a version of the truth. Weir's father says we've read about it in the papers. But of course, what Weir's father will have read is the Allied version of events, which is much, much more positive and upbeat, of course, because they want to maintain the support for the war of those back home. So they're not reading the true extent of the suffering. So they don't have the ability to understand. And then Stephen picks it up beautifully on page 422, and Elizabeth is reading his journal, his translated journal at this point. And he says, no child or future generation will ever know what this was like. They will never understand. He says, when it is over, we will go quietly among the living, and we will not tell them. We will talk and sleep and go about our business like human beings. A brilliant simile to confirm the idea that the soldiers will exist in the world after World War One, but they will not really live in it. They have ceased to be human beings in the sense that the rest of the world understands human beings, and that confirms why we can't connect with them. And we will seal what we have seen in the silence of our hearts, and no words will reach us. That's the real impossibility of remembrance right there. But I also mentioned that Faulks is ultimately critical of our fear of reconnecting. We see it in Weir's return home. His father seems to be terrified of hearing the truth. And then Stephen sees it when he goes on leave and he lands in England. Stephen saw the looks on the faces of the crowd change from gaiety to bewilderment. The lean, expressionless creatures who stepped ashore were not the men with gleaming kit and plump smiles who had been played aboard by regimental bands. Of course, what the people back home want to remember is the regimental bands, the sense of celebration, the sense of patriotism and glory and duty and honour that they were fed at the start of the war. They don't want to confront the horror of what has happened or the horror of what these men have become. And we see it in the shopkeeper. Stephen goes to buy some clothes to try and make himself feel more normal, if you like, and the shopkeeper kept a certain distance. He doesn't want him in the store because he doesn't want him or his customers to have to confront the reality of World War One. I'm going to introduce you to a little bit of wider reading now, which supports some of the ideas that I've been talking about here. The first one is Richard Aldington's Death of a Hero, and this is published in 1929, 11 years after the end of World War One. It is a semi-autobiographical novel, but it is fictional. It depicts Aldington's experiences of World War One through the fictional character of George Winterbourne. It is an exceptionally bitter novel, which is highly critical of the attitude of the home front and women in particular. And Aldington seems to be angry about the notion of glory and false heroism that the rest of the world seems to cling to in their remembrance of World War One. I'm going to look at a couple of sections now. This is early on in the novel, and here Aldington seems to be particularly bitter and angry about notions of heroism. The death of a hero, what mockery, what bloody cant, what sickening putrid cant. George's death is a symbol to me of the whole sickening bloody waste of it, the damnable stupid waste and torture of it. You've seen how George's own people, the makers of his body, the women who held his body to theirs, were affected by his death. And then at the end he talks about a minute's silence. I know there's 2 minutes silence, but after all, a 2 minute silence once a year isn't doing much. Deeply critical of our attempts to remember, much more critical than Faulks is in Birdsong. He at least allows us to understand the reasons why, but I suppose Faulks is writing with the benefit of hindsight many, many years later, whereas this novel is written in almost the immediate aftermath of World War I. But he does allow us to understand in some way, Aldington, why we can't understand the soldiers. These were men. There was something intensely masculine about them, something very pure and immensely friendly and stimulating. They had been where no woman and no half-man had ever been, could endure to be. There was something timeless and remote about them, as if, so Winterbourne thought, they had been Roman legionnaires or the men of Austerlitz, or even the invaders of the empire. They looked barbaric but not brutal, determined but not cruel. Under their grotesque wrappings, their bodies looked lean and hard and tireless. They were men. Yes, they are men, but they are a new form of men, and it is a version of men that the society they return to could not understand. Very similar to the reshaped notions of masculinity that we see in Birdsong. And the second novel I want to look at is All Quiet on the Western Front. This one is particularly interesting because it is written from the perspective of a German soldier, Paul Baumer. It's fictional again. But what that does, because if you read this novel, unless you knew it was from a German perspective, you wouldn't notice any difference in the experiences of this soldier to the experiences of the Allied soldiers that we read about in so much other World War I literature. There seems to be less difference between the German soldiers and the Allies than there is between the soldiers and their families back home. Their families are much more alien to them than the soldiers that they're fighting across no man's land. So it shows quite how unique that experience was and gives us an understanding of the way that we cannot possibly hope to truly remember or connect with that world. It is a much less optimistic novel than Birdsong, full of bitterness, again like Aldington's novel, about the patriotic rhetoric pre-war and post-war, and the soldiers are painted very much as victims of that hollow patriotic rhetoric. We see in this example here the unique connection between the soldiers, and so we sit facing one another, cat and I, two soldiers in shabby battle dress roasting a goose in the middle of the night. We don't talk much, but we have a greater and more gentle consideration for each other than I should think even lovers do. We are two human beings, two tiny sparks of life. Outside there is just the night, and all around us death. We are sitting right at the edge of all that, in danger but secure. Goose fat runs over our fingers, our hearts are close to one another, and time and place merge into one. What does he know about me? What do I know about him? Before the war we wouldn't have had a single thought in common, and now here we are, sitting with a goose roasting in front of us, aware of our existence, and so close to each other that we can't even talk about it. There's an intense closeness about the soldiers that the world outside can't possibly begin to understand. And finally, not quite so relevant to this point, but does confirm the distance that exists between the world of war and the world back home. In her novel Testament of Youth, Vera Brittain describes the great barrier of experience and feeling between women and the men who they loved. It's not through a lack of desire to understand in this case, but it is through a complete inability to understand what they went through. But she also points out, by depicting the experiences of women, that the men could also not understand what the women have been through. The women are also victims here. And so it's not a one-way street. It's not just about our inability to understand what they went through. It's also the war's inability to understand what they went through back home. So in summary, Birdsong, a novel, yes, which is critical of our attempts to remember the war, but the modern sections of the novel do actually help to highlight that true remembrance is ultimately futile and impossible, and we should not pretend to connect in any meaningful way with the events of the past, because the two worlds are utterly disparate. There is no connection between them, and therefore the blame is not all the modern world's, although there is certainly a criticism from Faulks about the way in which we distance ourselves from the events of World War One.